Module 4, The Leadership of Susan B. Anthony. Unit 1, Lesson 3, Building Background Knowledge. Guiding questions. What makes someone a leader of change? How can one person make a difference? Learning targets. I can determine the main idea of sections of an informational text about Susan B. Anthony. I can summarize an informational text about Susan B. Anthony. Let's take a look back on the timeline that we read in Lesson 1. And this time, as we look through it, we're going to circle the events that were related to women's suffrage. Suffrage is a word that means the right to vote. 1777. Women lose the right to vote in New York. 1780. Women lose the right to vote in Massachusetts. 1784. Women lose the right to vote in New Hampshire. 1807. Women lose the right to vote in New Jersey, the last state to allow women to vote. 1848. The Women's Rights Convention takes place in Seneca Falls, New York. 1878. Congress rejects the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. 1920. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. Now that we've identified 7 events from the timeline that are related to women's suffrage, it's time to figure out what were the most important events of the time. I see that the first 4 details that we circled were all about women losing the right to vote in different states within America. I'm going to focus on the very last one, the one that in 1807 that says women lose the right to vote in New Jersey, the last state to allow women to vote. That's significant, more significant than the other ones, because that was the last state that had previously allowed women to vote, and now no women in America had the right to vote at this time. That's why I think this is one of the more important events to highlight. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the last 3 details. I see that in 1848 the Women's Rights Convention took place in Seneca Falls, New York. That seems very important to women's suffrage in general, so we're going to keep that one. In 1878 Congress rejects the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. That's also significant because that is something else that kept women from voting. And finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. Certainly we're going to keep that one because that was what everybody was after in the women's suffrage movement. They wanted women to have the right to vote, and here in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women that right. Okay, now it's time to put those events into a timeline. You'll see that our timeline starts in 1775 and it goes through 1920. It's currently blank. We're going to put in those events that we identified from the timeline from our book. We're going to put those events into this timeline to keep track of them and also be able to see how those all fit in with each other. The first event happened in 1776, and although we didn't highlight this from our timeline because we didn't think about it being related to women's suffrage, it is important, and so in 1776 the Declaration of Independence is written. This is important because in that declaration it claims that all men are created equal, men meaning both men and women. And then in 1787 the U.S. Constitution was finally ratified. Those are important events to all Americans, so I'm going to include those in on our timeline. For the rest of the events, we're going to plot them in time order. In 1807, women in New Jersey lose the right to vote, which was the last state to do so. In 1848, Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. In 1878, Congress rejects Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed, giving women the right to vote. Throughout our module, we'll be adding more events to our timeline as we learn about them, but for now, these are the events that we are starting with. The Vote by Rebecca Hershey. Imagine that when you grow up, you are not allowed to vote for the next president of the United States. You're not allowed to vote on certain laws that may affect you and your family. And your opinion does not matter. Why? You are a woman, and you do not have the right to vote. If you try to vote, you will be arrested. That was then, perhaps when your grandmother's mother was a little girl. Today, however, voting is one of the most important rights we all have, men and women. But how did things change? There were many women through the years who worked very hard, sometimes devoting their entire lives, giving speeches, forming women's groups, picketing, writing politicians, anything they could do to change the laws that kept women from voting. But there was one little girl who grew up to be one of the most important women of all in the fight for the right to vote. In 1820, in the small town of Adams, Massachusetts, a little girl was born. She was one of 8 children. Her mother and father named her Susan Brownell Anthony. When Susan was 11 years old, she rushed home from school very upset. She told her father that the teacher refused to teach her long division in her math class because she was a girl, and there was no need for her to know such things. Her father was just as upset and decided from that moment on to homeschool all 8 of his children. When Susan grew up, she became a teacher. It was one of the few occupations women were allowed to pursue. Susan taught for several years, but then had to go home and help her family take care of their farm. When she did venture from home again, it was to meet a woman many people were talking about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was very involved in the fight for women's rights, but men felt that she was just stirring up trouble. However, Susan very much wanted to meet her, and she did. In 1872, Susan and several other women tried to vote in their hometown and were quickly arrested. But nothing could stop Susan Anthony or Elizabeth Stanton and so many others. It was a cause worth fighting for. More than 40 years later, women picketed outside the White House, asking President Wilson to pass an amendment to give all people the right to vote. On this day, November 14, 1917, many of the women peacefully picketing were injured by soldiers and violence broke out. The women were once again arrested, but as the country began to hear about the terrible unrest in the country, there were signs of real change. Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton kept up the fight for women's rights for more than 60 years. One of the last things Susan said in a speech was failure is impossible, and she was right. Although Susan died in 1906, 14 years before the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution gave women the right to vote, her work was not in vain. On August 26, 1920, 20 million women finally won the right to vote. So when you are old enough, remember to vote. Remember Susan B. Anthony and all the other women of courage who fought to make it possible. Let's go ahead and look back at our first learning target for today. It says, I can determine the main idea of sections of an informational text about Susan B. Anthony. The text is The Vote, which we just read. And when we're trying to find the main idea of sections, I'm going to ask myself 2 questions. Number 1, who or what is this text or section mostly about? And number 2, what is the big or important thing I learn about him, her, or it? Summarizing informational text recording form for The Vote. Part 1. Getting the gist. after reading this text for the first time, what do you think this text is mostly about? Record your gist in the space right below. Part 2. Identify the main idea for each section of the text. But there was one little girl who grew up to be one of the most important women of all in the fight for the right to vote. In 1820, in the small town of Adams, Massachusetts, a little girl was born. She was one of 8 children. Her mother and father named her Susan Brownell Anthony. When Susan was 11 years old, she rushed home from school very upset. She told her father that the teacher refused to teach her long division in her math class because she was a girl, and there was no need for her to know such things. Her father was just as upset and decided from that moment on to homeschool all 8 of his children. Now that you've listened to that section again, remember to ask yourself those 2 questions when figuring out the main idea. Who or what is the text or the section mostly about? Well, I can see from the article the person that this section is about is Susan B. Anthony. The next question I'm going to answer is, what is the big or important thing I learn about him, her, or it? In this case, it's her. What do we learn about Susan B. Anthony in this text? Sometimes it can be really difficult to determine which details are not as important as others and which ones are the ones that we should focus on. And so I want you to think about the fact that we are learning about Susan B. Anthony for a reason. She led an extraordinary life. She led a life that was different than other people around her, and that's why we know her name. That's why we learn about her, because she was a leader. She set herself apart from other people in the work that she did for women's rights. And so when you are listening to this section of the text and trying to figure out what is the most important information that we learn about Susan B. Anthony in this section, we want to make sure that we aren't picking out details such as the fact that she was born in 1820. Lots of people were born in 1820, but we're not learning about them. She had 7 siblings. She was one of 8 children. Again, lots of people at this time had lots of children in their family, so this isn't what sets her apart. So what we need to be thinking about is, what is it that sets her apart from other people at this time? And that's why we're learning about her. That's what the author wants us to take away from this section, and that's what we're going to write about for our main idea. I'm giving you a little framework here to help you respond to the main idea for paragraph 5. Susan B. Anthony was one of the blank important people who fought for blank. She learned at a young age that people treated blank differently than men. And so here we have a main idea statement taken right from paragraph 5, and it answers the big questions: who or what is the text about, and what is the most important thing that we learn about her. Make sure you fill in the blanks. Do not leave them blank on your paper. You may pause the video at any time if you need more time to finish this section. Part 2. Identify the main idea for each section of the text. When she did venture from home again, it was to meet a woman many people were talking about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was very involved in the fight for women's rights, but men felt that she was just stirring up trouble. However, Susan very much wanted to meet her, and she did. In 1872, Susan and several other women tried to vote in their hometown and were quickly arrested. But nothing could stop Susan Anthony or Elizabeth Stanton and so many others. It was a cause worth fighting for. Okay, after rereading paragraphs 7 and 8, it's time to think about the main idea of this section. And so we ask ourselves the question, who or what is the section mostly about? Of course, the whole text has been about Susan B. Anthony, so the answer wouldn't be any different here. Who the text is about is Susan B. Anthony. And then what is the big or important thing I learn about her from this section? And so if you need to, you can glance back at the text, you can reread, think about what is it that set her apart from everyone else, what does the author want us to understand about her from this particular section. So we have to focus on the details that are in paragraphs 7 and 8. Okay, again, I'm going to give you an outline or a framework from which you can use to help you respond to the question here, which is what is the main idea of the section 7 and 8. And so you're going to use this sentence starter, fill in the blanks. Susan B. Anthony met blank, and together they fought for blank, even getting arrested for their cause. So go ahead and you can go back into the text, fill in those blanks, and that will help you write your main idea statement for this section. More than 40 years later, women picketed outside the White House, asking President Wilson to pass an amendment to give all people the right to vote. On this day, November 14, 1917, many of the women peacefully picketing were injured by soldiers and violence broke out. The women were once again arrested, but as the country began to hear about the terrible unrest in the country, there were signs of real change. Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton kept up the fight for women's rights for more than 60 years. One of the last things Susan said in a speech was failure is impossible, and she was right. Although Susan died in 1906, 14 years before the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution gave women the right to vote, her work was not in vain. On August 26, 1920, 20 million women finally won the right to vote. So when you are old enough, remember to vote. Remember Susan B. Anthony and all the other women of courage who fought to make it possible. Now that you've listened and reread paragraphs 9 through 12, we're going to come up with a main idea statement about these 4 paragraphs. So again, we're going to ask ourselves that question, who is the text about? What is the big or important thing that I learn about her? So of course we know that the whole text has been about Susan B. Anthony, and so is this section. So we've got the first question answered. What do we learn about Susan B. Anthony in this section that we haven't learned about in the other section? So there's a lot of things that happen here. You just want to pick out some of the most important. You can even combine some of them together if it works. Remember that we want to focus on things that set her apart from other people at the time. There's a reason that we're learning about here. So just the fact that she died, that isn't necessarily something that we would put for the main idea, because that's not what the author wants us to walk away from. Everybody dies. So that isn't something that sets her apart from other people. So when you're focusing on, okay, what do we learn about Susan B. Anthony in this section? The answer to that is going to be your main idea, and you're going to put it in the space provided. Pause the video if you need more time to finish this section. Part 3, summarizing the text. After thinking more closely about this text, summarize the main ideas of this text. Use several specific details from the text in your summary. Now here we're heading at learning target number 2, which is I can summarize an informational text about Susan B. Anthony. In order to do that, we're going to first analyze the text structure of the article, The Vote. When analyzing the structure of a text, what we're trying to do is figure out how the author organized information. Now, there are many different types of text structure, and all of them have different keywords. So one that's always easy to look for are dates and times. And so that's where I'm going to start today. I want you to look for and circle any keywords and dates that you might find in this text, the vote. Okay, I'm skimming the text, looking for any keywords or dates, things that tell me about time passing. And my eyes are just skimming, skimming, skimming. I see in 1820 circled. Skimming down further, when Susan grew up, that's telling me about time passing. Moving on to the second page, in 1872, I see another date. In the next paragraph, more than 40 years later, a couple of sentences later, on this day, November 14th, 1917. I'm seeing a lot of dates, and I'm circling a lot of dates. In the second to last paragraph, more than 60 years. Then, although Susan died in 1906, okay, that's telling us a date, 14 years before, and then in the last paragraph I see the words, on August 26th, 1920. So you see that we actually found a lot of dates and keywords that help us figure out that this text is written in chronological order. That means time order. Okay, so back to part 3, summarizing the text. Now that I know that the text is written in chronological order, that will help me when I am writing my summary of it. It's good to understand what the text is structured like, because it might determine how you write your summary. So if you look over here to the left, I have some information here about how to summarize. A summary tells the main points of the article. It has a topic sentence that tells you who the text is about and what do we learn about her. So that's very similar to the main ideas that we were figuring out before. Then you would include at least 3 details, and they must be in order that you find them in the text. They must be in time order when the text structure is chronological. And then finally you would have a conclusion statement just restating what you learned, who you learned about, and why they are important. In order to create your topic sentence, you can go back and take a look at some of the main idea statements that you've written for the other sections. But it should definitely start off with Susan B. Anthony's name. So you would say something like, Susan B. Anthony was best known for blank, and then you would fill in the rest with at least 3 details, perhaps one from her early life, one from the middle of her life, and then one from the end of her life. And then you would finally conclude what we learned about Susan B. Anthony, why she was important, and sort of maybe what she helped accomplish for women's suffrage. Good luck. You can do it. Pause the video if you need more time to finish this section. Let's review our learning targets. I can determine the main idea of sections of an informational text about Susan B. Anthony, and I can summarize an informational text about Susan B. Anthony. We did both of those things. We practiced finding the main idea and summarizing. Remember that to determine the main idea, we need to ask ourselves 2 questions. Who or what is the text about, and what is the big or important idea I'm learning about him, her, or it?